I still see the flash of panic in my wife's eyes, the harsh sunlight bouncing off the polished badges of the HOA enforcers as they surrounded her on our front lawn. They were there to hand down yet another violation, one that made no sense whatsoever. They arrived without warning, though I'd already grown accustomed to their random intrusions since moving into Pinebrook Hills a few months ago. When I rushed outside to see what was going on, I found my wife clutching her arm, a vivid bruise shaping itself just above her elbow. My heart pounded so fiercely that I could scarcely hear anything else. Their faces had that smug grin I'd come to know, the same grin I'd encountered on certain men overseas who believed they could never be held accountable. I promised myself I'd keep my cool, but adrenaline flared in my bloodstream. I realized these strangers, these women in neat polo shirts embroidered with the HOA logo, had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. The tallest among them, Karen Fillmore, wore her authority like a crown. She had decided to lay down her own law on our property without considering the consequences. I had spent 22 years as a Navy SEAL, but that fact was nowhere on my mortgage documents. They saw a middle-aged man in a quiet cul-de-sac, just another homeowner who might cave under their intimidation. The moment I witnessed my wife trembling in pain, something ancient and fierce awakened in me, something that had been dormant since I'd left the service. Yet I also felt the echoes of discipline drilled into me over many tours. I would not lose control. I would not become a savage. Instead, I would wait. I would gather my thoughts and aim for a more precise form of justice. I didn't expect to find a battlefield in a suburban community. My wife Sonia and I relocated to Pinebrook Hills, hoping for quiet evenings and friendly neighbors. We were tired of apartment living and craved a small patch of land to call our own. We had lived through noisy cities, unpredictable neighborhoods, and the uncertainty that often follows active duty families across the country. After I finally retired, we seized the chance to settle in a place that promised tranquil streets lined with maple trees, a homeowners association that, at least on paper, seemed dedicated to preserving community standards for the benefit of everyone. The real estate agent had shown us glossy brochures, manicured lawns, a well-maintained lake nearby, broad walking trails meandering through pristine wetlands. It looked like a postcard version of the American dream. No one told us that the HOA could turn your dream into a personal nightmare if you inadvertently crossed their invisible lines. The day we moved in, we were greeted by a friendly wave from the neighbors across the street, but the very next morning, a letter arrived from the HOA stating we had left a cardboard box by our curb for too long. Apparently, it violated some obscure rule about unsightly trash. It felt petty, but we paid no mind, imagining it was just how suburban HOAs operated. That was our first miscalculation. A month later, we received a formal notice threatening a fine because our mailbox was the wrong shade of green. Sonia rolled her eyes, but I shrugged. Painting a mailbox was no big deal. Except she loved that mailbox. It was a whimsical piece she'd found at a craft fair. She tried appealing, sending an email to the HOA board asking for a short grace period or an explanation of the correct color code. We got a curt reply. Immediate compliance is expected, no exceptions. That was the first time I saw her frustration ignite over something that seemed so minuscule. She and I argued that evening. Though neither of us was truly angry with the other, we felt cornered by an arbitrary set of rules that seemed more about control than community welfare. We repainted the mailbox in a drab shade the HOA demanded, feeling our sense of personal choice slip away, but we told ourselves we'd let it pass. Little did we realize how much worse it would get. Sonia planted a small garden out back. She's a passionate horticulturist with a keen interest in preserving local pollinator species. She finds solace in cultivating native flowers. That was precisely the kind of gentle, environmentally responsible project this neighborhood supposedly welcomed. However, within a week, the HOA's enforcers, a small clique led by Karen, started coming around with measuring tapes, cameras, and an attitude so pompous you'd think we were criminals. They claimed that certain plants were non-compliant because they were taller than the height limit for ornamental greenery. Sonia was flabbergasted. The plants in question, such as milkweed and bee balm, were crucial for butterflies and bees. She tried explaining the ecological benefits. Karen responded with a smirk and an additional threat of fines. The pattern was clear. Any endeavor that didn't line up with Karen's personal taste became a target. I'd seen power-hungry figures in my life. I had encountered warlords, corrupt officials, and shady middlemen during my tours, but I never expected a suburban homeowner association to challenge my patience on this level. Karen's tactics were reminiscent of those feudal lords who held people's livelihoods in their hands. The difference here was that her weapon of choice was a thick rule book written in deliberately vague language. She had an uncanny ability to twist a single line in the HOA guidelines into a reason for imposing penalties. That draconian approach seemed to energize her clique of enforcers, mostly women who had either too much free time or too little empathy. They thrived on ordering neighbors around. I felt obligated to keep the peace. Our new mortgage wasn't cheap, and we had heard horror stories of HOAs placing liens on homes for unpaid fines. We wanted no part of that, and so we tried compliance after compliance, only to discover that once the enforcers smelled fear, they bared their teeth more often. We had lived through 6 months of minor skirmishes before the day Sonia got hurt. 6 months of pointless citations, repeated threats of fines, notes left on our door about unapproved yard furniture, and claims that our backyard tomato plants were visible over the fence line. It had been an unceasing barrage of petty complaints, and we found it strange that none of our nearby neighbors seemed to get targeted. When Sonia asked around, the Johnsons next door admitted they'd once been threatened with fines, but decided to bribe one of the board members to dismiss it. The details were vague, but the story reeked of corruption, and no one else seemed courageous enough to fight back. Possibly they'd given in or simply didn't want to risk losing their homes over what might look like trivial battles. I started suspecting something far more insidious was happening behind the scenes. My gut told me to gather evidence, but life got in the way and I set aside that suspicion. Then came the morning the enforcers stormed our property unannounced. It was a glorious Saturday. Sunlight streamed over the horizon, bathing the yard in a soft glow. Sonia was bending down to harvest her peppers, wearing gardening gloves and humming a tune. I was inside, rinsing dishes and savoring the normalcy of a weekend at home, when I heard sharp voices from the backyard. I dried my hands and approached the window. Karen stood there with 3 other women, brandishing their clipboards and cameras like official badges of authority. I spotted one woman recording with a phone as Karen barked an accusation. The garden was out of compliance again, because a revised rule demanded a 2-foot clearance from the property line. Sonia calmly tried explaining we had never been notified of a new rule, but Karen's response was a harsh scoff. She insisted her team had the right to inspect and remove anything they deemed in violation. I saw Sonia shake her head. Then, with startling aggressiveness, one of Karen's associates stepped forward and gave her a shove. She fell sideways onto the stone walkway. Her gloved hand braced her fall, but the impact made her shoulder collapse beneath her weight. A cry escaped her lips. It cut through me like a bullet. I dropped everything, sprinted out the door, and within seconds was standing between those enforcers and my wife. Karen's eyes widened, but I kept my composure. I cradled Sonia's arm while glaring at them. They claimed they had the right to secure the property for official documentation. My fists tightened. My muscles tensed as decades of training urged me to neutralize the threat. However, a silent voice within me whispered that reacting with violence would only strengthen their case. I needed to be surgical about this. Karen's team had the audacity to claim Sonia tripped. I stared at them, seething. Sonia tried to stand, but pain contorted her face. I was certain she'd done something to her shoulder. "I'm calling the police," I said firmly. I wouldn't relent on that. Karen shrugged, flicking a lock of her hair to the side with an air of dismissive authority. "Be my guest," she said. "We follow standard HOA procedure." Then they turned and walked away, cameras and clipboards in hand, as if they'd done nothing more than record a harmless inspection. I knelt beside my wife, checking her injury, trying to keep my voice calm. She winced, struggling to move her arm. Rage burned in my chest, but I forced it down. Anger without strategy is wasted energy. When the local police arrived, the responding officer showed more interest in Karen's version of events than Sonia's. He kept glancing at the yard and flipping through the HOA guidelines Karen thrust into his hand. It was a horrifying realization. If the local cops were sympathetic to the HOA, then we were at a disadvantage. Sonia insisted she'd been shoved, but the officer simply scribbled a few notes and concluded there wasn't enough evidence to press charges. We were left on our own. I watched that police cruiser disappear around the bend. It felt like a betrayal, but I resolved not to let it rattle me. My training had taught me that systematic injustice requires thorough dismantling. Gather intel, identify weak points, and strike with precision. My immediate priority, however, was getting Sonia treated. I loaded her into our SUV carefully, then drove to the nearest urgent care facility. The doctor confirmed a dislocated shoulder, along with deep bruising that would take time to heal. She would be wearing a sling for a good 2 weeks, and her normal activities would be severely limited. Yet her resilience never faltered. Sonia insisted that she was fine, that we needed to focus on the real problem. As we returned home later that evening, I couldn't ignore the fire in her eyes. She wanted justice too, but her approach had always been about rational argument, clarifying misunderstandings, trying to reason with people. I had no illusions left. Reasoning with Karen and her clique was no more productive than trying to sweet-talk an incoming rocket. I started mapping out a plan. Old habits die hard. While I might have left the active battlefield behind, I still remembered every lesson in intelligence gathering and infiltration. I quietly began to keep a log of every HOA communication we received, every citation, every photograph they snapped. Sonia scoured the bylaws, printing out sections that seemed contradictory. A pattern emerged that indicated arbitrary rule changes. We also discovered that Karen repeatedly cited changes to community guidelines that had never been voted on or even announced to residents. It was all so brazen. Had no one ever challenged her? I decided to speak with neighbors who had lived here longer. Many of them were oddly reluctant to talk about the HOA. They offered half smiles, quick nods, and excuses to end the conversation. I felt a wave of déjà vu. In certain conflict zones, villages cowered under the oppression of local militias. Fear made good people silent. Eventually, I found the Carmichaels, an elderly couple who had nothing left to lose. Mr. Carmichael confided that Karen had forced them to remove a wheelchair ramp for violating aesthetic uniformity. They'd eventually replaced it in secret with a temporary solution that wasn't up to code, all to avoid Karen's wrath. That's when I heard how Karen and her associates sometimes threatened liens, forced evictions, or inflated fines to coerce compliance. Mr. Carmichael had tried calling the county authorities, only to be told it was a civil matter, and the HOA had broad powers in the community. The Carmichaels were resigned to their fate. I knew that kind of resignation, the slow acceptance of subjugation. However, I was done being polite. My wife's injury was an inflection point. I set up 3 discrete cameras around our property, capturing every angle the HOA enforcers might use to approach us again. I upgraded the security system and purchased a data storage device with multiple backups. Then, I compiled a list of possible lawyers. Yet finding an attorney willing to take on an HOA was surprisingly difficult. The law firms I contacted either asked for exorbitant retainers or claimed no expertise in HOA disputes. I understood the subtext. Challenging an established HOA can be an uphill battle, one that often bleeds a client's finances dry. Sonia urged me not to let frustration push us into reckless choices. I nodded, remembering how focus and patience were essential in any operation. So we pressed on, each day collecting more intel, scouring social media for any mention of Karen or the board members, scanning public records for irregularities in how they spent community funds. The more we dug, the more I realized the entire HOA might be a personal money-making scheme under the guise of community improvement. Yet, speculation needed proof. That proof arrived unexpectedly through a chance encounter. One evening, while retrieving the mail, I noticed a middle-aged woman pacing near the community clubhouse. Her expression bore the same strain I had seen in too many other residents. I asked if she was all right. She looked around nervously and admitted she was the HOA's previous administrative assistant before quitting 2 weeks ago. She recognized me from Karen's problem list, a rumored internal document that flagged uncooperative residents. She whispered that she had seen financial documents indicating large sums of money flowing into suspicious accounts that had nothing to do with normal HOA expenses. I gently coaxed her into sharing more. She seemed terrified, but also eager to unburden herself. She agreed to email me copies of some relevant files. 3 days later, I received them. The sums were staggering. Tens of thousands of dollars allocated for community beautification had been withdrawn, yet no record existed of actual projects. Another line item indicated enforcement expenses, which turned out to be inflated budgets for Karen's personal security firm. I realized this was bigger than a petty tyrant with a rulebook. It was potentially a large-scale embezzlement scheme. That level of corruption needed more than just a civil lawsuit. I quietly reached out to a friend who had connections in local investigative circles. While he was no longer an active duty officer, his network was extensive. He advised caution. HOAs, especially ones deeply embedded in the local political structure, had allies in the police department or city council. We'd need irrefutable evidence and a well-coordinated plan. He put me in touch with a retired detective named Russ Parker, a man known for unraveling municipal corruption. Parker agreed to meet me in a diner outside town. He was tall, with silver hair and a grizzled face that radiated competence. Over black coffee, I showed him the documents I had. He asked me whether I was prepared for a fight that could become expensive, lengthy, and personally taxing. I told him I'd been through worse. He grunted in approval. The next step was to see if we could confirm the pattern by talking to contractors who supposedly worked on HOA projects. Parker and I made discreet phone calls, cross-referencing invoices with real businesses. We discovered multiple suspicious businesses listed. Some were defunct, others had never existed. Meanwhile, I kept receiving fresh citations from Karen. She seemed determined to break our will with an onslaught of petty punishments. The fines piled up. Our mailbox was not replaced with an approved model, even though we'd painted it as instructed. Our backyard fence was allegedly 3 inches over the height limit. Our front flower bed contained unapproved mulch color. The bills soared beyond $2,000 in less than a month. The final straw was a threat to place a lien on our house if we did not pay promptly. Sonia and I discussed it late one evening. Paying the fines would only embolden them, but ignoring them risked an actual lien. Meanwhile, Parker was making progress. He told me to hold tight. Building a case took time. That's when I decided to orchestrate a more direct confrontation, both to lure them into a mistake and to capture their behavior on camera. I started by sending a polite but firm letter to the HOA board, demanding a hearing to dispute the fines in person. Legally, they had to allow a formal hearing. Karen scheduled it 2 weeks later in the community clubhouse, presumably to display her power in front of the board. Sonia's shoulder was still healing, and I could see the quiet determination in her eyes. She told me not to let them intimidate me. I promised her I wouldn't. I also promised myself I'd stay composed, because that was how you toppled a fortress from within. Parker gave me a tiny recording device to wear inside my shirt. If Karen slipped or made incriminating statements, we would have evidence beyond mere suspicion. The hearing day arrived. The clubhouse was as sterile and over-decorated as I expected. Bright overhead lights, walls adorned with pictures of impeccably landscaped gardens. Karen sat at the head of a long table, flanked by her enforcers, none of whom were men. Her group seemed to be a tight-knit circle of similarly minded women who shared her appetite for control. She gave me a condescending smile. "Mr. Bonds, we understand you have concerns regarding recent fines. Please present your case briefly. We have a full agenda." Her voice held the edge of a ruler who believed she was untouchable. I calmly laid out the repeated citations, highlighting the inconsistencies in the guidelines. I referenced alleged changes that were never voted upon. I asked for an explanation of the financial records. Where exactly were these fees going? She waved a manicured hand. "All allocations are determined by the board's budget. You agreed to these terms when you moved in. Everything is above board." Some of her associates smirked. A few residents in the room averted their eyes, seemingly powerless. Then, in a final twist of brazen arrogance, Karen stated, "We'll proceed with the lien if you do not pay these fines immediately." Her voice lowered. "Might I remind you, the association has the legal right to recover what's owed." Parker, seated inconspicuously at the back, observed quietly. I shrugged off my initial impulse to retort with anger. Instead, I calmly asked them to verify the guidelines that gave them the power to impose a lien for an unapproved mailbox color. Karen's response was chilling. When people don't follow the rules, they must pay. Or they pay even more. The entire exchange reeked of intimidation. I politely ended my remarks, letting her believe we were beaten. In reality, every word was captured on Parker's device. That day, I recognized the scope of my adversary's confidence. Karen believed no resident would ever dare challenge her power in a real court. Her downfall, though, was that she counted on silence and ignorance. Behind the scenes, Parker was working to connect the dots on the financial side. Each conversation brought new revelations. An HOA beautification project that existed only on paper, consulting fees to phantom companies, suspicious reimbursements for Karen's personal purchases. We found that the city councilor who oversaw local zoning had received hefty donations from entities tied to Karen. The local police department, or at least certain officers, also seemed compromised. No wonder the responding officer had sided with them after Sonia was hurt. The deeper I dug, the more I realized we needed external pressure from a higher authority. Through Parker's contacts, we prepared an anonymous packet of evidence for the state attorney general's office. Still, we needed one more piece to guarantee action: direct proof of malicious intent, or something akin to a confession. I was well aware that corporate criminals rarely leave obvious confessions lying around. My best bet was that Karen's sense of invincibility might lead her to incriminate herself in front of the wrong person. That chance appeared one morning in the form of an unexpected visitor. I found her on the edge of my property, a middle-aged woman with nervous eyes who introduced herself as Belinda, a new enforcer in Karen's circle. She had evidently grown uneasy with how Karen was running things. She confessed that she'd overheard talk of forging documents related to our alleged fence violation. Karen wanted to escalate the confrontation, likely hoping to provoke us into an action that would justify a heavy financial penalty or allow them to forcibly remove us through a sheriff's sale. Belinda seemed torn. She'd been enticed by Karen's offers of easy money, but felt sick about the cruelty involved. The damage to Sonia's shoulder weighed on her conscience. "You deserve to know," she whispered, pressing a small USB drive into my hand. I thanked her quietly, offering no further discussion. This was the break I needed. That evening, I plugged the USB into my laptop. It contained recordings of Karen and her closest allies discussing not just me, but a range of other targeted residents. One video clip, presumably captured by Belinda's phone in secret, showed Karen boasting about how these suburban sheep fall in line once you threaten their homes. They can't risk losing their biggest investment. They always cave. My blood boiled, but I forced myself to watch calmly. Another snippet depicted her bragging about funneling the HOA funds to a personal account under the label executive contingencies. She claimed nobody would suspect a suburban mother. She sneered that the local authorities were easily persuaded. I leaned back in my chair, heart racing. This was a smoking gun. Armed with those recordings and Parker's carefully compiled file, I sent the entire packet to the Attorney General's office, this time with my real name attached. I also sent a copy to a local reporter known for exposing corruption in small-town politics. Then I made the hardest call, informing the local police that I possessed evidence of possible criminal activity. My trust in the local police was minimal, but I needed to establish a paper trail. A detective named Castillo agreed to meet me off-site, confiding that she had suspected something was off about Karen's operation, but lacked evidence. Castillo seemed earnest. She took down every detail, scanning the documents with intensity. "Give me a few days," she said. "I'll see what I can do." Sonia and I waited anxiously. Meanwhile, citations kept coming. Karen's enforcers filmed our property from the sidewalk, occasionally stepping onto the lawn, speaking loudly about illegal modifications. I wondered if they sensed the net closing in. On a Sunday morning, around 2 weeks after I'd sent everything off, I saw the patrol cars. Several lined the street outside the HOA office, lights flashing. Karen stood on the curb, arms crossed, glaring at the officers as they moved in and out of the building, carrying boxes of files. She spotted me in my yard and gave me a look of pure venom. I said nothing. This was a warranted search, presumably triggered by the weight of the evidence we'd handed over. My phone buzzed. It was Detective Castillo, confirming they had enough for probable cause. She thanked me for stepping forward. "I'm not sure who else was about to do it," I replied. However, I knew the game wasn't over yet. Raids and evidence seizures could take months to sort out, and Karen's lawyers might try to quash everything. I had to maintain vigilance. That evening, Sonia and I received a bizarre letter in our mailbox, presumably from Karen's attorney, threatening a defamation lawsuit. It claimed we had spread malicious rumors about the HOA's leadership, damaging their reputation. I called Parker. He chuckled darkly, pointing out that this was a standard intimidation tactic used by cornered adversaries. "Don't let it shake you," he said. "They're on the defensive. They'll try everything." I stayed calm, trusting that truth was on our side. Over the next few days, more neighbors approached me discreetly, many confessing they'd faced extortion from Karen's group. They thanked me, saying they admired how we were standing up, though they feared retribution. I tried to reassure them that if we stayed united, Karen couldn't bully everyone. 2 weeks later, the real turning point came. Detective Castillo called, asking if I could come down to the station. There, in a quiet interview room, she revealed that the Attorney General's investigation was expanding beyond our local HOA and into a web of interconnected HOAs across the county. Apparently, Karen had her hand in multiple associations, orchestrating a wide-scale funneling scheme. The evidence from Belinda's USB proved crucial. The recordings of Karen boasting about forging signatures and pocketing HOA funds established an undeniable pattern of fraud. Castillo then handed me a copy of Karen's latest petition for a restraining order. Against me. "She's claiming you threatened her life," Castillo said, raising an eyebrow. "Any truth to that?" I nearly laughed. "I've never threatened her," I replied. "She's just hoping to make me look like the aggressor," Castillo sighed, acknowledging it as another desperation tactic. She explained that the restraining order hearing would take place in a few days, and Karen's best shot was to paint me as a dangerous ex-soldier who had threatened violence. Sonia was livid, but I assured her I'd handle it. On the day of that hearing, I wore a modest suit and arrived early with Parker at my side. Karen came flanked by 2 attorneys. She put on a performance worthy of an amateur soap opera, claiming she was terrified for her safety. Her voice quivered theatrically as she insisted that a trained killer was living across the street, making veiled threats. The judge, an older man with a stern expression, listened patiently. Then it was my turn. We presented the recordings that showed Karen instructing her enforcers to provoke me, the photos of my wife's injuries, the financial documents proving Karen was engaged in fraudulent activity. The judge's demeanor shifted. "Mrs. Fillmore," he said, "it appears you have quite a bit of explaining to do." He denied her petition and sternly warned that legal maneuvers meant to harass or intimidate would not be tolerated. Karen left in a fury, slamming the courtroom door. I stood there breathing a sigh of relief. In the following days, the local newspaper ran a front-page article detailing the allegations against Karen and her associates. The headline read, "HOA President Investigated for Embezzlement Fraud." Photos of the raid on the HOA office accompanied the story. More residents found their courage and came forward, reporting similar instances of illegal fines, forged documents, and personal harassment. It was as though a dam had broken. Once people realized they weren't alone, their voices flooded in. The momentum was unstoppable. Meanwhile, Sonia continued her recovery. Her shoulder improved, though some mornings she still experienced sharp pain. Each time she winced, I felt renewed determination to see justice done. I secretly prepared for any form of retaliation. I remembered how cunning individuals could become when cornered. Sure enough, I received a menacing letter typed in bold capital letters. No signature, of course. It threatened to ruin my life if I continued interfering. The text included references to my military past, implying they knew about certain missions. I frowned. There was no way they could have real details, so it was likely a bluff. I gave it to Parker, who added it to the growing evidence of intimidation attempts. The next night, 2 women from the HOA tried to place a bogus notice on our door, claiming our mortgage was invalid due to some archaic covenant. My newly installed camera captured them. By then, the climate in Pinebrook Hills was shifting in our favor. Neighbors were no longer silent. I heard from a young couple down the road. Karen had forced them to remove a small memorial bench dedicated to their late child. Another man explained how he'd paid exorbitant fees just to avoid confrontation. Each story spurred me on, fueling my resolve. About a month later, the big day arrived. Karen and 2 of her top enforcers were formally charged with multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit extortion. The Attorney General's office moved swiftly, freezing accounts linked to them. I watched from across the street as the authorities placed Karen in handcuffs. She glared at me, but I felt no triumph in that moment, only relief that the tyranny might be ending. However, I couldn't forget that others were involved, like the city councilor who took bribes or the officer who'd ignored our assault complaint. Parker hinted that the investigation was still expanding. As I stood there with Sonia, she rested her head on my shoulder, the sling finally gone, replaced by a faint scar of memory. "You did it," she whispered. I shook my head gently. "We did it," I said. "You never gave up either." In the aftermath, a temporary board took over the HOA's affairs, under the guidance of a court-appointed administrator. An audit showed that the association's funds had been siphoned off for years, leaving the roads and common amenities neglected. The new leadership began the slow work of rebuilding trust. Fines were waived for dozens of residents. Payment plans were established for those who had been forced into financial duress by Karen's policies. For the first time since we'd moved here, the atmosphere in Pinebrook Hills felt lighter. You could sense the relief in the air. Families let their kids ride bikes along the cul-de-sacs without fear. People stopped whispering. They openly discussed improvements for the neighborhood. As for Karen, her trial became a local spectacle. Multiple victims took the stand, recounting the intimidation they'd endured. Sonia's testimony was particularly powerful. She calmly described how the enforcers had assaulted her, the emotional toll it took, and the callousness with which Karen's group had dismissed her injury. The prosecution presented the financial records, the recordings from Belinda's USB, and Parker's compiled evidence. It was overwhelming. Karen's attorneys did their best to paint us as rabble-rousers or conspiracy theorists, but the judge saw through their theatrics. In the end, Karen was found guilty on multiple counts. Her cohort struck plea deals that implicated her further. She received a prison sentence that might not have been as long as some desired, but it was justice nonetheless. When the final gavel came down, Sonia and I sat in the courtroom, quietly holding hands. A wave of calm washed over me, the sort I used to feel when a mission was successfully completed without casualty. Outside, reporters shoved microphones in my face, asking how a retired Navy SEAL ended up tangling with an HOA president. I offered a concise statement. I swore an oath to defend against enemies foreign and domestic. I never expected I'd have to defend my wife from a local association's corruption. But I'd do it again if I had to. I left it at that. The cameras clicked and whirred, but I was ready to return to a life of simpler things. Sonia teased me later that evening, saying the story had become quite the local legend. The retired SEAL who took on the neighborhood tyrant. Over the following months, The shift in Pinebrook Hills felt almost miraculous. Freed from Karen's oppressive rule, the association turned its focus to genuine improvements, repaving roads, renovating the clubhouse, establishing programs for native plant restoration. Exactly the kind of ecology projects Sonia had advocated all along. The wetlands near the walking trails became part of a modest conservation effort. Younger families who once considered moving out stayed, encouraged by the new spirit of cooperation. In a striking contrast, neighbors who'd barely spoken before began hosting potlucks, planning a community garden, and looking after one another. That intangible sense of unity took root. Ironically, it was Karen's corruption that had sparked people's renewed commitment to looking after each other. Sonia's garden finally thrived without harassment. Bees buzzed among the milkweed and monarch butterflies danced above the cone flowers. I built a sturdy trellis, carefully measuring every beam, proud to see the vines climbing higher each day. It felt symbolic of our perseverance. Our finances took a hit from all the legal fees, but we managed. And we received partial restitution when the court ordered Karen to repay misappropriated funds. The new board even sent an apology letter, an official acknowledgement that the previous leadership had harmed us. It wasn't about the money. It was about the principle. Sonia, with her characteristic warmth, volunteered to lead a neighborhood workshop on sustainable gardening. People showed up, exchanging seeds and ideas. In that circle, I saw the best face of a community once overshadowed by fear. Detective Castillo stayed in contact, updating me occasionally on the broader investigation. The city councilor, with suspicious donations, faced a separate inquiry. Several participants who had turned a blind eye to Karen's methods resigned or found themselves under scrutiny. Real change rarely comes in sweeping gestures, but each small step matters. I recognized a parallel to the missions I once carried out. Seldom was there a single heroic moment that fixed everything. Instead, success came from countless coordinated efforts. A few months later, Parker and I had coffee to debrief the events. He cracked a rare smile, remarking that he usually dealt with small-time embezzlers or petty corruption. You turned a suburban HOA story into a case that's cleaning out an entire ring of local officials, he said. That's not something you see every day. I reminded him that, in my experience, corruption at any level can become malignant if left unchecked. Sometimes it takes just one spark, a small push against a man's wife, to set off the chain reaction that topples the house of cards. Days turned into weeks, then months of relative peace. The new HOA leadership streamlined the rules, ensuring they were sensible, clearly written, and most importantly, fairly enforced. Annual meetings actually felt productive. Sonia's greenhouse was never questioned again. We continued to receive supportive notes from neighbors, thanking us for exposing the rot that had festered here for so long. I couldn't help but find satisfaction in witnessing so many people finally feeling safe to voice their opinions without fear of reprisal. A part of me missed the sense of mission that once defined my military life. But seeing this community flourish reminded me there are battles worth fighting even in peacetime, especially when it involves safeguarding one's family and neighbors. One afternoon, I was wiping down the workbench in my garage when Sonia called for me. She stood at the fence line, waving over a young couple from 3 doors down. They introduced themselves, explaining that they wanted to create a backyard orchard but were worried about potential pushback. Sonia reassured them that the new board was open-minded. The relief in their eyes was evident. They thanked us for making it possible. Sonia gave my hand a squeeze. At that moment, I realized how far we'd come from the day we first arrived, clueless about the oppressive reign that awaited us. The quiet contentment we'd sought was finally ours, yet it was richer now, because we'd earned it through struggle. Sometimes I reflect on that confrontation in our backyard, the one that ended with Sonia being shoved to the ground, and I wonder what might have happened if I hadn't chosen a disciplined response. If I had lashed out in anger, if I had attempted to settle it with my fists, would the truth have ever come to light? It's likely that Karen would have spun the narrative of an unhinged ex-SEAL attacking honest HOA volunteer. Instead, I chose a more methodical route, and ironically, it was that approach that brought real justice. Even Sonia's injury, while awful, became the catalyst that galvanized a whole community to speak up. No act of violence or intimidation can stand long against persistent truth. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson we discovered. At the end of that long journey, I look around at our home with a renewed sense of gratitude. The garden bursting with color, the house standing in defiance of all the attempts to break us. We have a sense of fellowship with our neighbors, an appreciation for the law enforcement personnel who ultimately did the right thing, and a recognition that not all laws or systems are flawed, just the people who corrupt them. While I never sought out this confrontation, it was forced upon us. In a sense, I was prepared for it long before I even imagined living in Pine Brook Hills. My military training taught me resilience, strategy, and above all, calm under pressure. This suburban conflict demanded every ounce of that discipline. And so I sit on our back porch at twilight, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. Sonia rests her head on my shoulder, the final traces of her injury fading into memory. Our cat dozes near my feet, safe in a yard where no one will barge in with a clipboard demanding we comply with some half-baked rule. The lights from nearby houses shine softly, and the hush of the neighborhood feels peaceful rather than tense. It's the peace we once thought we were purchasing, but ultimately we had to fight for it. Occasionally, I let my mind wander back to the day those enforcers stepped onto our property with such confidence. I suspect they never guessed how thoroughly we would unravel their operation. Perhaps they believed no one would challenge them, that each threat and citation would erode our determination until we gave up. They were wrong. I might have hung up my uniform, but the oath I swore, the vow to stand against injustice, remains woven into me like an unbreakable thread. And if anyone else ever forgets that, they need only look at how quickly one determined man and his resolute wife can transform a neighborhood from fearful compliance to collective hope, simply by refusing to be silenced.